August 17, 1943, New Guinea, 7:42 a.m. A P-38 Lightning erupts off the runway engines, screaming like something alive and furious. Wheels leave the mud. The sky swallows it whole. Inside that cockpit sits Robert Hayes, 23 years old, 6 missions flown, 0 kills confirmed. And somewhere above the jungle, 18 Japanese Zeros are already turning to meet him. 18 against 1. The math is obscene. The outcome, according to every chart, every manual, every officer who has ever studied the Pacific Air War, is already written. Hayes dies. The Zero wins. Again. Except today, something is different. Hidden inside the boom of that Lightning behind a panel nobody official has opened sits 6 inches of piano wire bent into a Z shape by a mechanic with grease under his nails and blood on his thumb. No authorization, no paperwork, no metal waiting at the end. Just wire tension and a decision made in the dark by a man nobody was watching. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more incredible stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Every week, we bring you the secrets history forgot to mention. In 7 minutes, Robert Hayes will shoot down 3 enemy aircraft and walk away from a fight that should have killed him. In 3 months, the loss ratio over New Guinea will flip completely. Japanese aces who have owned these skies for years will start filing reports that sound almost like confusion. And it will all trace back to one mechanic who decided that good enough was unacceptable. His name was James McKenna. You have never heard of him. That is exactly the problem this video is going to fix. By the summer of 1943, the Pacific Air War over New Guinea was not going the way American commanders had promised. The P-38 Lightning was supposed to be the answer. Twin engines, heavy armament speed that could outrun nearly everything in the Japanese inventory. American pilots were handed a manual and told the doctrine was simple. Boom and zoom. Dive fast, fire. Once climb away before the enemy can respond. Do not turn with a zero. Ever. Turning with a zero was how you died. The problem was that doctrine worked perfectly on paper and died the moment it met actual Japanese pilots. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was one of the most maneuverable fighters ever built. Light responsive, capable of turning inside almost anything the Americans could put in the air. Japanese pilots had spent years mastering that turning advantage, and they used it with a precision that was almost contemptuous. They did not need to be faster. They just needed to be tighter. And when a P-38 dove in fired and tried to climb away, a Zero pilot would simply roll-cut the angle and arrive at exactly the place where the Lightning would be in 3 seconds. Not where it was. Where it would be. 37 P-38s lost in 6 weeks. That is not a statistic. That is a graveyard. Pilots came back with the same description every time. Controls feel mushy. She won't roll when I need her to. One flight leader said his Lightning handled like it was thinking about turning before it actually did. Then he stopped making jokes. Then he stopped flying. Commanders filed the reports efficiently. Pilot error during defensive maneuvering. Stamp. File. Next loss. The official position was that nothing was wrong with the airplane. The airplane was within specifications. The specifications were correct. Therefore, the problem was the men flying it. 17 pilots dead in McKenna's squadron alone. Not strangers. Faces. Guys who borrowed his socket wrench. Guys who complained about the heat every single morning like complaining would cool anything down. Guys who said, "See you after the sortie," and absolutely meant it. McKenna was not a pilot. He was a technical sergeant, a mechanic, a man whose entire purpose was to keep other men's aircraft functioning. He did not attend tactical briefings. He was not consulted on doctrine. His opinion was not part of any official conversation happening above his pay grade. His job was simple. Keep the tolerances within spec. Sign the forms. Move on. But McKenna listened. That was his particular and dangerous talent. While officers studied charts and pilots argued about tactics, McKenna worked the flight line with his hands pulling on control cables, feeling the aircraft speak in a language that paperwork could not translate. And every time he grabbed an aileron cable on a P-38, he felt something. A whisper. A tiny, almost invisible give in the line. The kind of slack you would measure in fractions of an inch. The kind of delay you would never notice sitting still on the ground. The manual said the tolerance was acceptable. The factory said the numbers were within specification. The engineers had signed off. The paperwork was immaculate. The paperwork was also killing people. McKenna understood something that the reports were missing. In peacetime, a quarter-second delay between a pilot's input and an aircraft's response is meaningless. In combat against a Zero pilot who has spent years calculating exactly that kind of delay into his attack geometry, a quarter-second is the entire difference between the bullet missing you and the bullet finding you. The P-38 was not defective. It was just slow enough to die by. He raised it once. He was told the tolerances were within spec. He raised it again. He was told the factory had approved the design. The third time, he stopped raising it and started thinking. Robert Hayes found him on the flight line one evening, not looking for a superior officer, not looking for a briefing, just looking for a mechanic. Hayes was 23 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who had learned to fly because he thought speed was freedom, and had spent the last 6 weeks watching that belief get buried alongside his friends. He had followed doctrine perfectly and watched it fail perfectly. He was done with doctrine. He had one question, and he brought it to the one man he thought might actually answer it. Is there anything you can do to make it roll faster? No bravado. No rank pulled. Just a young man asking the wrong person the right question at exactly the right moment. McKenna looked at him and saw something terrifyingly clear. If nothing changed, Hayes was already dead. The timeline just hadn't caught up yet. He told Hayes to come back in the morning. Then he waited for the hangar to empty. What McKenna was planning was not in any manual. It was not approved, suggested, or theoretically permissible by any regulation the Army Air Forces had ever printed. Unauthorized modification of a primary flight control system using non-standard components. That was the technical description. The unofficial description was considerably simpler. A bad idea executed by someone who had run out of patience for acceptable losses. The solution he had settled on was embarrassingly small. At the edge of the airfield sat a P-38 that had been written off, already declared dead by the paperwork waiting to be stripped for parts. McKenna went to it in the dark and pulled 6 inches of high-tensile piano wire from its rudder trim assembly, the kind of wire designed for precise sustained tension. He brought it back to Hayes's aircraft, pulled the inspection panel, and stared at the aileron cable that had been quietly failing people for months without technically failing at all. He bent the wire into a Z shape with pliers that had seen better decades. The wire fought him, cut his thumb, drew blood. He wedged it into position as an improvised tensioner forced the pin back into place and pulled the cable again. No delay, no give. The control surface snapped like it had been personally offended and was responding out of spite. 8 minutes. That was all it took. 8 minutes to do what months of official channels had refused to consider. McKenna closed the panel, wiped the blood on his coveralls, and stepped back. The aircraft looked completely identical to every other Lightning on the line. No markings, no indication. Just a P-38 with a secret hidden inside its boom, and a mechanic standing in the dark trying to calculate whether he had just saved a life or ended his own career. Possibly both. Probably both. He did not sleep. He stood on the flight line the next morning and watched Hayes roll toward the runway at 7:42 a.m., climb into a sky that had no idea what was about to happen, and disappear into the Pacific haze. 17 minutes later, Hayes found his 18 Zeros. The interception looked like every other disaster the P-38 pilots had been surviving for months. Zeros above angles closing the kind of tactical situation the manual said to escape from immediately. Hayes dove on the edge of the formation, fired, missed. The Zero he targeted snap-rolled and fled. Standard. Expected. The old P-38 would have sluggishly tried to follow and given up. Hayes moved the stick. The Lightning answered now. Not after a pause. Not with that maddening fraction of a second lag that had been eroding every tactical advantage American pilots thought they had. The aircraft rolled like it had been waiting its entire existence to be asked properly. Hayes felt it the moment it happened. Every pilot who has ever flown describes that sensation the same way. When the machine and the man finally agree completely instantly without argument, it feels like the aircraft learned your mind. Hayes stayed with the Zero, fired again. The enemy aircraft came apart in the air. His first kill. 6 months in the Pacific. 6 weeks of watching friends die. And the airplane had been capable of this the entire time. 3 more Zeros came for him immediately. Doctrine screamed, "Run." Hayes had stopped listening to Doctrine. He reversed hard. The Lightning snapped around so fast, the attacking Zeros overshot their own geometry, the precise timing they had built their entire attack around suddenly wrong by exactly the margin McKenna had removed from that cable. 2 of them died in the reversal. The third fled. 7 minutes. 3 kills. 1 pilot. 1 secret. When Hayes landed and walked past every person on the flight line to find McKenna, he said 2 words. It worked. That was all. But 6 other pilots had watched that fight from altitude, and they had seen something that P-38 Lightnings were not supposed to do. Not ever. Not once in the entire history of the type over New Guinea. It rolled like it meant it. Captain Mitchell was one of them. He landed, walked past the congratulations, found McKenna, and asked one question. "Can you do mine?" By sunset, Mitchell's P-38 had the same wire. By the end of that week, it was spreading the way the best secrets always spread in wartime. Fast, quiet, and completely impossible to stop. No memos, no forms, no official authorization, just mechanics whispering and pilots nodding, and a modification being installed at night and removed before morning inspection, like a confession that needed to stay between friends. Officially, nothing had changed. Unofficially, pilots started coming home. And then, something happened that made the officers genuinely uncomfortable. The statistics moved. Loss ratios shifted. Zeros that had owned the turning fight for a year began overshooting. Japanese pilots who had been flying the same traps for months found the traps closing empty. Their reports came back confused. The Americans were not flying differently. Their airplanes were answering faster. 6 inches of wire. Hidden inside hundreds of identical aircraft. Behind panels no enemy intelligence officer would ever think to open. A change so small it was invisible, and so decisive, it was already rewriting the arithmetic of survival over New Guinea. McKenna kept turning wrenches. Hayes kept flying. The paperwork kept filing reports about improved tactics and better training, completely unaware that the air war had already tilted on something a man could hide in his pocket. But the secret was not going to stay quiet forever. Someone was going to find the wire. And when they did, the question of what happened next, whether McKenna faced discipline or vindication, whether the modification died in a regulation or became the standard, would determine everything. That answer is coming in part 2. 6 inches of piano wire. 8 minutes in the dark. 3 kills in 7 minutes. By the end of the first week, McKenna's modification had spread to a dozen P-38s across 2 squadrons, installed at night and hidden before morning inspection, like a secret that everyone knew and nobody admitted. Pilots were coming home. The numbers were moving. And somewhere in the chain of command, someone had started asking questions about why cable tension readings were inconsistent across aircraft that had passed identical inspections. That someone was Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Vance. And he was about to make McKenna's life considerably more complicated. Vance ran the maintenance division for the 5th Air Force with the precision of a man who had built his entire career on the belief that regulations existed because someone smarter had already thought through every possible situation. He was not cruel. He was not stupid. He was something more dangerous than either. He was certain. certain that the P-38 performed within acceptable parameters, certain that pilot error was responsible for the losses, certain that an unauthorized modification to a primary flight control system installed by a technical sergeant using salvaged wire was not a solution. It was a liability. He found McKenna on the flight line on a Tuesday morning and did not waste time with pleasantries. "You bent piano wire into a control cable tensioner and installed it on a combat aircraft without authorization, without engineering review, without a single signature from anyone above your pay grade." Vance's voice was completely level. "Do you understand what you've done?" McKenna did not look up from the engine cowling he was closing. "Yes, sir. I tightened the controls." "You violated Article 92. You could be court-martialed." "Yes, sir." "The modification is not approved. It will be removed from every aircraft it has been installed on. Today." McKenna set down his wrench and looked at the colonel directly for the first time. 17 pilots are dead, sir, from this squadron. In 6 weeks. The modification has been on 12 aircraft for 8 days, and we haven't lost one." Vance stared at him. "That is correlation, Sergeant, not causation, and it is not your job to make that determination." "No, sir, it's yours." The silence between them lasted exactly long enough to become uncomfortable. Then Vance turned and walked away, and McKenna picked up his wrench, and officially nothing had been resolved. But Vance did not immediately order the wire removed. He went back to his office and looked at the loss reports again. And something in the numbers bothered him in a way he could not quite dismiss. The modification should have been removed that morning. It wasn't. That hesitation was the first crack in the wall. But McKenna was not going to win this through silence and statistics alone. He needed someone with rank. He needed someone who had seen what Hayes had done and understood what it meant. He needed Captain Mitchell. Mitchell had 17 confirmed kills, and the kind of reputation that made colonels at least temporarily consider listening before dismissing. He had flown the modified P-38 himself. He had felt the difference with his own hands, and had come back from the next 3 missions alive in situations where a month earlier the arithmetic said he shouldn't have been. When McKenna explained the problem with Vance, Mitchell did not hesitate. "I'll talk to him. Give me the technical breakdown. Everything. Numbers, cable tension measurements, the original tolerances, what you changed and why. If we're going to get this approved, we do it properly." They spent 2 evenings building the case. McKenna provided the mechanical logic. Mitchell translated it into language an officer could carry into a briefing room. The core argument was simple enough to state in 1 sentence. The factory tolerance allowed a delay of approximately 0.3 seconds between pilot input and control surface response. Against a Zero pilot who had calculated American aircraft behavior down to fractions of a second, that delay was not a specification. It was a kill probability. Mitchell presented it to Vance on a Thursday afternoon. He brought the maintenance logs, the loss reports, the cable tension measurements, and the combat records of the 12 aircraft currently carrying the modification. He asked for one thing: a formal test. Controlled, observed, documented. 1 modified P-38 against 1 standard P-38, in a simulated turning engagement with a Lockheed engineer present to evaluate the safety of the tensioner under load. Vance looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he said the only thing a man in his position who is genuinely uncertain can say. 1 test, 1 aircraft. If the engineer clears the modification as safe, we proceed. If he has any concern about structural integrity or fatigue loading, it gets pulled immediately, and we never discuss this again." Mitchell nodded. McKenna, who was not in the room, heard about it 4 hours later and understood that he had exactly 1 chance to prove that he had not simply gotten lucky. The test was scheduled for a Saturday morning, which gave McKenna 48 hours. He did not sleep much of them. He pulled the modified aircraft from the line and went through every inch of the tensioner assembly, checking the wire for stress fractures, measuring the load distribution, testing the response at full deflection in both directions. He brought in 2 other mechanics he trusted completely and had them check his work independently. 3 sets of hands. 3 independent assessments, all identical. The modification was sound. The Lockheed engineer arrived Friday evening. His name was Hartley, a small, precise man from Burbank who wore clean clothes in a place where clean clothes were a philosophical statement. He examined the tensioner for 40 minutes without speaking. McKenna stood nearby and did not offer opinions. When Hartley finally spoke, he asked one question. What gauge is the wire? High tensile piano wire, equivalent load rating to the original factory cable in this application. Hartley looked at it again. You bent this by hand. With pliers. Hartley said nothing. He made 3 notes on his clipboard and closed it. Saturday morning, 6 aircraft parked in a row. 2 designated for the comparison test. 1 standard P-38 with factory tolerances intact. 1 modified aircraft with McKenna's tensioner. Vance was present with 2 other officers. Hartley had his clipboard. 4 pilots who had heard what was happening positioned themselves near the edge of the field, with studied casualness, pretending to have other reasons to be there. The test was simple. Both pilots would fly identical approach patterns and attempt a hard reversal on command at a specified airspeed. Ground observers with stopwatches would measure the time between the command signal and visible control surface deflection. The difference, if any existed, would be measurable and documented. The standard aircraft went first. The pilot flew the approach, cleanly received the signal, and reversed. The observers clicked their stopwatches. The result was unremarkable. The aircraft performed exactly as the manual said it would. Within specification. The modified aircraft went second. Hayes was flying it. Nobody had asked for a particular reason. It just happened that way. He came in at exactly the specified airspeed wings level, and when the signal came, he moved the stick. Every person watching saw it simultaneously. The Lightning snapped. Not gradually, not with the slight lag that everyone had learned to accept as normal. Instantly. The control surface was moving before the observers had fully processed that the signal had been given. 2 of the stopwatches recorded 0.31 seconds for the standard aircraft. Both recorded 0.09 seconds for the modified one. Nobody spoke for a moment. Vance looked at his stopwatch, then at the aircraft still turning above them, then at McKenna. 0.09. One of the other officers said quietly, as if saying it louder might change the number. Hartley opened his clipboard and wrote something. The modification reduced response lag by approximately 71%. Under the load conditions I observed and the wire specifications Sergeant McKenna used, I find no structural or fatigue concern with this application. He paused. It should have been in the original design. That sentence landed in the silence like something heavy being set down after being carried too long. Vance approved the modification for all aircraft in the squadron that afternoon. Within 2 weeks, a request had gone up the chain for authorization to apply it fleet-wide. Within a month, Lockheed had been informed. The engineers ran the numbers, reviewed Hartley's field assessment, and reached the same conclusion he had. It was safe. It was effective. It should have been there from the start. The rollout was not simple. Mechanics had to be briefed at each location, supplies of appropriate wire had to be sourced through channels that were not designed for this kind of small urgent requisition, and there were unit commanders who received the modification order with the particular skepticism that career officers reserve for changes they did not originate. McKenna traveled to 3 different airfields in 2 weeks, demonstrating the installation, answering questions, and occasionally standing in front of men who outranked him considerably, and explaining why 6 inches of bent wire was worth their attention. Most of them flew the modified aircraft once and stopped asking questions. In the air, the results that had begun in one squadron started appearing across the theater. P-38 pilots who had been surviving through discipline and doctrine suddenly found that the aircraft was cooperating with them in a way it never had before. Zeros that had been threading the turning fight with practiced confidence began overshooting. Attacks that should have connected were arriving a fraction too late. Japanese pilots filed reports describing American P-38s that moved differently than expected. Not faster in straight-line speed, faster in decision, as if the lag they had built their tactics around had simply been removed, which was precisely what had happened. By October, Japanese commanders in the theater had formally noted the change in their operational summaries. They could not identify the cause. The aircraft looked identical. Wreckage from downed P-38s revealed nothing unusual. Whatever the Americans had done was invisible, and it was working, and there was no counter to something you could not find. McKenna's name appeared in none of these reports. He was a technical sergeant. He fixed aircraft. He kept turning wrenches. But somewhere in Tokyo, intelligence officers were staring at numbers that refused to make sense and reaching for an explanation that did not yet exist in any document they had access to. They knew the Americans had changed something. They did not know what. They did not know how small it was. They did not know that it had started with blood on a mechanic's thumb and a decision made in an empty hangar at midnight. They were about to start looking harder. And when Japanese intelligence finally focused its full attention on the mystery of the faster Lightnings, it would set in motion something McKenna had never anticipated. Not a tactical response, not a technical countermeasure, something more dangerous than either. A hunt. Part 3 begins with a Japanese ace who has figured out that the answer is not in the cockpit. It's behind a panel, and he is willing to do whatever it takes to find it. 6 inches of wire, 1 mechanic, 1 night. That is how Part 1 ended. In Part 2, the modification survived a court-martial threat, passed a formal engineering test with a 71% improvement in response time, and spread across the 5th Air Force with the quiet inevitability of a truth that refuses to stay hidden. By October 1943, P-38 pilots were winning fights they had been losing for a year. The loss ratios had flipped. And somewhere in Tokyo, intelligence officers were staring at numbers that made no sense and reaching for explanations that did not exist in any document they had access to. They knew something had changed. They did not know what. They were about to dedicate significant resources to finding out. And the answer they were hunting was small enough to hold in one hand. By November 1943, Japanese Air Command in the Southwest Pacific had compiled 3 months of loss data and reached a conclusion that nobody in the room wanted to say out loud. The P-38 Lightning was not the same aircraft it had been in July. Not in speed, not in armament, in responsiveness. Their veteran pilots were not losing because they had become worse. They were losing because their timing perfected over 2 years of combat was suddenly wrong by exactly enough to be fatal. The numbers told a brutal story. In June 1943, Japanese Zero pilots held a kill ratio of approximately 2.1 to 1 against P-38s in turning engagements over New Guinea. By September, that ratio had collapsed to 0.7 to 1. The Zeros were now losing the turning fight, the one fight they had always been guaranteed to win. 8 veteran pilots with confirmed kill counts above 15 had been shot down in a 6-week period. Men who had survived Midway Guadalcanal and 2 years of continuous combat were dying in engagements that should have been routine. Commander Saburo Takahashi presented the analysis to his superiors in Rabaul on November 4th. His conclusion was direct. The Americans had modified the P-38's control system. The modification was invisible from the outside. It produced no identifiable acoustic or visual signature. Captured wreckage had been examined 3 times, and nothing found. Whatever they had done was inside the aircraft small and extraordinarily effective. The response from command was immediate. Find it, by any means necessary. 2 intelligence operatives were assigned to the problem. A technical team was dispatched to examine the next P-38 wreckage recovered intact, and Takahashi himself began adjusting Zero tactics away from turning engagements, entirely shifting to high-speed diving attacks that neutralized the Lightning's new responsiveness by removing the need to outturn it. The strategy kept pilots alive longer. It also abandoned the Zero's greatest strength. Japan was changing its entire Pacific Air doctrine because of 6 inches of wire that nobody had officially found yet. But the enemy's tactical crisis was not McKenna's most immediate problem in November 1943. His most immediate problem was Sergeant First Class Walter Briggs, a maintenance chief at a newly converted airfield in Nadzab, who had received the official modification order, read it 3 times, decided it was either a mistake or a trap, and installed it incorrectly on 4 aircraft by using standard cable wire instead of high-tensile piano wire, because the correct specification had not been clearly communicated in the written order. On November 9th, one of those 4 aircraft experienced a partial control failure during a hard reversal at altitude. The pilot recovered. The aircraft landed. Nobody died. But the incident report went up the chain immediately, and within 48 hours, there were officers in 2 different commands using it as evidence that the McKenna modification was fundamentally unsafe and should be suspended pending a full review. McKenna heard about it through Mitchell, who called it in plain language. "They're trying to bury it. The Briggs installation used the wrong wire, wrong load rating. It has nothing to do with your design, but someone is going to write a report that doesn't make that distinction. And if that report reaches the right desk before you do this, is over." McKenna traveled to Nadzab the next morning and examined all 4 aircraft personally. The error was exactly what Mitchell had described. Wrong wire specification. Wrong tensioning method. The modification had not failed. It had been incorrectly installed by someone who had received inadequate instructions. McKenna documented every finding in writing, had Hartley review his assessment by telephone, and filed a corrective technical bulletin within 36 hours that specified the wire gauge, the tensioning load, and the installation procedure in language that left no room for interpretation. The review board examined both documents. They cleared the modification and cited the Nadzab incident as an installation error, not a design failure. But the episode had cost 2 weeks of momentum and left a residue of doubt in exactly the institutional spaces where doubt was most dangerous. McKenna was aware that he was one serious accident away from losing everything. The modification was approved. The approval was fragile. What it needed was not another test or another report. It needed a battle. April 18, 1943, had already shown what was possible when American pilots in the Pacific caught a target that mattered and had the tools to take it. Operation Vengeance. The interception and shoot-down of Admiral Yamamoto's transport aircraft had been executed by P-38s, flying a mission of extraordinary range and precision. But that mission had used standard aircraft with standard controls and succeeded through planning navigation and timing rather than dogfighting. The modification had not yet been in widespread use. December 17, 1943 was different. The target was a large Japanese convoy moving resupply through the Vitiaz Strait, escorted by a substantial fighter cover of Zeros and Oscars operating from Wewak. The 9th Fighter Squadron flying modified P-38s was assigned top cover for B-25 strafers, making low-level attack runs on the convoy. The mission briefing estimated enemy fighter strength at between 30 and 40 aircraft. The Americans would be outnumbered from the first moment of engagement. 847. The B-25s go in low. The Japanese fighters come off the deck fast. The Zeros climb to cut the B-25s before they reach the ships. The P-38s roll in from above. The altitude advantage is standard. What happens next is not. A formation of 12 Zeros banks hard left to establish a turning defense against the diving P-38s. Standard response. Exactly the move that had worked against Lightning pilots for 18 months. The lead Zero pilot rolls into his reversal, calculating the American aircraft's response lag, placing himself where the P-38 will be when it finally completes its turn. The P-38 is already there. No lag, no delay. The Lightning snaps through the reversal with a speed the Zero pilot has never encountered in this aircraft type, And suddenly, he is not inside the turn. He is behind it, and the guns are pointing at him instead of past him. 3 Zeros fall in the first 90 seconds. The formation breaks apart. Pilots who have been trained to exploit the turning fight find themselves in a straight-speed engagement against an aircraft that is faster, heavier, and carrying 4 times their firepower. 2 more go down in the next 3 minutes. The convoy escort collapses from coordinated defense into individual survival maneuvers. The B-25s reach the convoy unmolested. Captain Daniel Voss, leading the 9th's top cover element, files the after-action report that afternoon. His language is precise and remarkable for what it does not say. He does not describe the modification. He does not mention wire or cable tension or specifications. He writes only that the aircraft performed with exceptional responsiveness during defensive maneuvering and that the squadron achieved results inconsistent with previous engagements against similar opposition. 9 Japanese fighters confirmed destroyed. 4 probably destroyed. The convoy loses 2 transport ships and 1 escort to the B-25 attack. American losses, 0 aircraft. 0. The after-action report lands at 5th Air Force Headquarters and gets read by people who have been watching the statistics shift for 4 months without a single clear engagement to point to. December 17th gives them that engagement. 9 confirmed kills, 0 losses. Against numerical odds of more than 3 to 1. The modification did not win that battle by itself. Pilots won it. But the modification gave those pilots an aircraft that answered when commanded, and in air combat, that is the difference between trying and doing. Takahashi received the report on the Vityaz Strait engagement 3 days later. He read it twice. Then he filed his recommendation to Raboul, command that all future engagements against P-38 formations should require numerical superiority of at least 4 to 1 to consider acceptable odds. 6 months earlier, Japanese doctrine had considered 2 to 1 sufficient against Lightnings. The modification had not just improved an aircraft, it had forced the enemy to double their commitment to achieve the same tactical confidence. The effect cascaded outward from December through February 1944. 12 squadrons operating modified P-38s reported consistent improvement in engagement outcomes. The combined theater statistics showed a 58% reduction in P-38 losses during turning engagements compared to the pre-modification baseline. The number of Japanese veteran pilots with kills above 10 lost during this period was disproportionately high, suggesting that experienced pilots who had developed muscle memory against the old P-38 response time were dying precisely because they were relying on the lag that no longer existed. American pilot confidence changed in a way that statistics cannot fully capture. There is a difference between flying an aircraft you trust and flying one you are compensating for. Pilots who had been taught never to turn with a 0 began turning with zeros because their aircraft now told them something different. The prohibition had existed because the P-38 could not win the turning fight. The modification did not make the Lightning more maneuverable than the 0. It made the Lightning's pilot the deciding factor instead of the aircraft's mechanical delay. And American pilots, trained harder, flying more hours, supported by better logistics, were more than capable of winning when the machine stopped fighting them. Japanese air strength over New Guinea did not collapse in a single moment. It eroded. Week by week through early 1944, the experienced pilots who could not be replaced were replaced by men who had fewer hours, less skill, and no institutional memory of how the Pacific Air War had been fought before whatever the Americans had done to their Lightnings. The knowledge that something had changed existed in Japanese command. The knowledge of what had changed did not. You cannot train against a modification you cannot identify. You cannot develop countermeasures for a problem you cannot see. McKenna received no medal for any of this. He received a commendation for the corrective technical bulletin he had filed after the Nadzab incident, which was a document that would not exist without the underlying modification, which was itself never formally attributed to him in any official record. His name appears in maintenance logs from this period in the same capacity it always had. Technical Sergeant, Flight Line Maintenance, signed and initialed in grease-stained handwriting on forms that nobody reads anymore. He kept turning wrenches. But somewhere in the records, if you look at the right maintenance logs from the right dates, there is a quiet pattern. Cable tension readings that are too consistent to be coincidental. Aircraft that were inspected and signed off, and then performed at a level the specification did not predict. A fingerprint in the paperwork of a man who never put his name on the history he was making. The war did not end over New Guinea. It continued for 2 more years, expanding and contracting across the Pacific in ways that no single modification, no single mechanic, no single squadron could determine alone. But the arithmetic of survival shifted in late 1943 and did not shift back. And the pilots who came home in 1945 included men who should not have made it through 1943 if the old delay had remained in place. What nobody has ever formally calculated is the number of children born after 1945 to fathers who should have died over New Guinea in the autumn of 1943. McKenna never counted them. He only remembered the faces that came back. He had that list memorized. But here is what the history books left out entirely. The story of James McKenna does not end with the war, what happened to him after 1945, and what happened to the modification that bore no name. And what a historian found 60 years later in a garage in Long Beach is a chapter that most people who know this story have never heard. That chapter is part 4. From a grease-stained technical sergeant bending wire in the dark to a modification that flipped the loss ratios of an entire air theater. From one pilot's question on a flight line in New Guinea to a formal engineering approval that Lockheed would eventually fold into the P-38's production design without ever printing the name of the man who proved it worked. Parts 1 through 3 told the story of how James McKenna changed the Pacific Air War with 6 inches of piano wire and a decision that should have ended his career. But Part 3 ended with a question that the statistics cannot answer. What happened to McKenna when the guns finally stopped? And what did he do with a victory that history never officially gave him? The answer is quieter than the story deserves. And that is exactly what makes it worth telling. The Army Air Forces discharged Technical Sergeant James McKenna in September 1946. No ceremony marked the occasion beyond the standard processing paperwork. He received his separation documents, his back pay, and a handshake from an administrative officer who had no particular reason to know who he was. The commendation he had received for the corrective technical bulletin was filed in his service record. The modification itself now incorporated into later P-38 production variants under an official Lockheed engineering drawing with proper terminology, and no attribution was not mentioned anywhere in his discharge papers. As far as the United States Army Air Forces was concerned, McKenna had served honorably maintained aircraft within specification and returned to civilian life. He drove back to Long Beach, California, rented a small property on the east side of town, and opened a garage. Not an aviation garage. An ordinary automobile repair shop with a hand-painted sign and a hydraulic lift he bought second-hand from a dealership that had closed during the war years. He fixed engines. He tuned carburetors. He charged fair prices and worked long hours and told almost nobody anything about what he had done between 1942 and 1946. Robert Hayes called him every August 17th without exception. The first call came in 1947 and continued for nearly 50 years. Hayes had gone back to Iowa, married the woman who had written him letters throughout the war, and was flying crop dusters over cornfields that looked nothing like New Guinea and everything like the life he had almost not come back to live. The calls were never long. Hayes would ask how the garage was running. McKenna would ask about the farm. Neither of them spoke directly about the modification, or the mission, or the 3 zeros that had come apart in the air over the Vitiaz Strait. They did not need to. The call itself was the conversation. It meant both of them were still there to make it. Captain Mitchell became a colonel and then a brigadier general and spent the remainder of his military career telling young officers a story they did not teach at the academy. That the most important person on an airfield is not always the one with rank. That the man who signs the forms and the man who understands the problem are not always the same person, and that confusing the two costs lives. Whether anyone listened is a separate question. Mitchell told the story anyway. Lieutenant Colonel Vance, the man who had threatened McKenna with a court-martial and then approved the formal test that saved the modification, retired in 1952 and never publicly discussed the episode. His official record shows no reference to the cable tension controversy. This is consistent with how institutions handle situations where regulations were correct on paper and catastrophically wrong in practice. The paperwork describes what should have happened. It does not always describe what did. McKenna never applied for recognition. He was aware that a historian or a journalist given enough time in the right archives could reconstruct what he had done. He was apparently not interested in making it easier for them. When a veterans organization contacted him in the mid-1960s about contributing to an oral history project on Pacific Air War maintenance crews, he declined politely and returned to his garage. But the modification he had made did not stay in 1943. That is the part of this story that extends past the individual and into something larger. The principle McKenna had applied eliminating mechanical delay in a control system to match the response time that a skilled operator requires did not disappear when the P-38 was retired from service. It became a foundational concern in the design of every high-performance aircraft that followed. The engineers who had examined McKenna's field installation and Hartley's assessment, and then incorporated the tensioner into the official P-38 design, carried that knowledge into their subsequent work. The lesson that a control system within acceptable factory tolerance could still be operationally unacceptable was documented in post-war engineering reviews, and influenced the way acceptable tolerance was defined in subsequent fighter aircraft specifications. During the Korean War, American pilots flying F-86 Sabres against Soviet-built MiG-15s reported that the Sabres' controls felt tighter and more immediate than anything they had flown in the Pacific, and that this responsiveness was the single most important factor in their ability to compete against an aircraft that held several theoretical performance advantages. The F-86's control cable specifications had been set using post-war standards that directly incorporated the lessons of 1943. The pilots who survived Korea over the Yalu River owed a debt to an engineering correction they had never heard of, made by a man whose name was not in their aircraft service manual. The broader principle extended further still. In civilian aviation, the post-war period saw a systematic reduction in control response lag across commercial aircraft designs, driven partly by the same engineering community that had learned from combat experience what delay costs in critical moments. The hydraulic and later fly-by-wire control systems that now govern every commercial flight in the world are designed around the assumption that pilot input must translate to control surface response with the minimum achievable delay. That assumption was not always self-evident. It was proven partly by 6 inches of wire in a New Guinea hangar in 1943. Estimates from post-war strategic analysis suggest that the modification across the period of its deployment from late 1943 through the end of Pacific combat operations contributed to the survival of between 80 and 120 American pilots who would otherwise have been lost in engagements where the quarter-second lag was the deciding factor. These are not precise numbers. They cannot be. You cannot run the counterfactual with certainty. But the analysts who reviewed the loss data before and after the modification's deployment, controlling for other variables including improved pilot training and increased aircraft production, arrived consistently at figures in that range. 80 to 120 pilots. Each of them a person who came home. Each of them letters that were written instead of telegrams. Each of them a thread that continued forward into children and grandchildren who exist today, because a mechanic decided that acceptable was not good enough. The deepest lesson of this story is not technical. The technical lesson that small improvements in system responsiveness produce disproportionately large outcomes in high-stakes environments is real and important, and has been applied thousands of times since 1943 in contexts ranging from military aviation to surgical robotics to financial trading systems. But that is not the lesson McKenna taught. The lesson McKenna taught is about the relationship between expertise and authority, and what happens when the two are housed in different people. McKenna had the expertise. He lacked the authority. The authority was held by men who had the rank, the credentials, the official responsibility, and the genuinely confident belief that if a problem existed, the system would have identified it. They were wrong, and the cost of being wrong was 17 pilots in 6 weeks. McKenna was right, and the cost of being right without authority was the threat of a court-martial. History is full of this dynamic. The doctors who proposed hand-washing before germ theory was established and were dismissed by institutions that considered the suggestion an insult to professional standards. The naval officer who argued for convoy systems in the First World War and was ignored until submarine losses became politically untenable. The engineers who raised concerns about equipment performance in cold temperatures before disasters that were later deemed preventable. In every case, the pattern is identical. The person with the most accurate understanding of the problem is not the person with the authority to address it. And the institution designed to prevent individual error also prevents individual correction. McKenna found a way through this pattern that most people in his position do not find. He did not wait for permission. He did not escalate until the escalation killed him professionally. He fixed the problem at midnight alone, and then let the evidence speak for itself in the form of a pilot who came home when the statistics said he should not have. That sequence quiet action followed by undeniable result is the only reliable method for changing a system that has decided it does not need to change. Now for the detail that most accounts of this story leave out entirely. In 2003, a researcher reviewing declassified Japanese intelligence files from the Pacific Theater found a document dated November 1943, originating from the Technical Analysis Division attached to Japanese Air Command at Rabaul. The document describes the conclusion of an investigation into why P-38 control response had changed. The investigators had examined 3 aircraft in detail and found nothing. The document's final line translated from the original reads approximately as follows: "The modification, if one exists, is either invisible to inspection or does not exist at all, and the change in American aircraft performance must therefore be attributed to pilot training improvements." They never found it. The most consequential modification to an aircraft in the Pacific Air War was never discovered by the intelligence service that spent months specifically looking for it. It was invisible, not because it was sophisticated, but because it was small. 6 inches of wire inside a panel that nobody thought to open with the right question in mind. McKenna was told about this document by the historian who tracked him to his Long Beach garage in the early 2000s. According to the historian, McKenna listened to the translation, was quiet for a moment, and then said they were looking for something complicated. That was their mistake. He died in 2006. His obituary mentioned his military service. It did not mention that he had once changed an air war while the enemy was looking the other way. From a technical sergeant with a pair of old pliers and 6 inches of salvaged wire to a modification that saved more than 100 lives, influenced post-war aircraft design across 2 generations, and was never once officially attributed to the man who invented it. James McKenna proved that the most dangerous thing in any system is not the enemy outside it. It is the delay inside it that everyone has agreed to accept. He removed a delay. Pilots came home. The rest is the history that never got written. That is the power of deciding that good enough is not.